Hey there, Kevin. Watching some of Andrew Wilson stuff has got me thinking about something that I noticed a while ago about rhetoric. Now, the way I was taught was with the breaking rhetoric into three rhetorical appeals, being the appeal to ethics, the appeal to emotion, and the appeal to logic. And for right now, we'll ignore the appeal to ethics. Now, generally, we can talk about the appeal to logic being the greater of the appeals, because logic is what the world runs on. So, for example, you could say, well, we can have an argument that has no emotional value, no appeal to the emotion, but is logically correct. And compare it to one which has an emotional appeal, but is logically incorrect. If we put that into practice, then the one that logically doesn't work isn't going to work. The one that emotionally doesn't work, if it gets put into practice, would work. So in that sense, I could say that the appeal to logic is superior. Another thing about the appeal to emotion is if you use an emotional appeal to get someone to believe a position, and then later on they find a reason to no longer support that position, and they realize that you would use an emotional appeal to get them to that position, they're going to be very adverse to the position. Really, even if they notice that an emotional appeal is being used, they'll be more averse to adapting to the position. Particularly if it's someone who thinks that the logical appeal is more important. So really, it can backfire. But let's go back to that example of the argument with only emotional appeal versus the argument with only logical appeal. The thing about emotional appeal is that it gets people to want to do things. So I think that's pretty obvious. Because think about, for example, if you're angry, you want to do something about that emotion. The emotion is talking about, like, your desire to go against whatever you're angry at. And so here's what I noticed is it's not, there's not just making an emotional appeal or not making an emotional appeal. There's also making a negative emotional appeal. That is, making an argument in such a way that the listener doesn't want to accept the argument. People that I've seen that I think are bad about doing this are Andrew Wilson on occasion, Luke Smith, And I think Professor Dave, though I don't have too much interaction with him, they're all apt to make arguments with negative emotional appeal that you, even if you agree that logically the argument makes sense, you don't want to agree with it. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, if it's not really that obvious, which I think, probably you can figure it out. But we'll step back a little. Why are you making your argument? Or, you could be making it directly to, who you're arguing against. So, someone who would be holding the opposite position. And you're trying to convince them that your position is correct. So that's one scenario. Another one is, could be more like a formal debate setting where, you're probably not going to be convincing the other person, but you're trying to convince the audience, who might be in a more neutral position, that your position is correct. And the third is when you're talking to someone who agrees with you, but you're trying to equip them on how to talk to someone who disagrees and convince them of your position. Well, in the first scenario, let's think about logic. It's not logical to do something which would decrease the likelihood of the other person accepting the argument. Same for the second scenario. In the third scenario, you might can get away with it. But you shouldn't be teaching the person to be taking that same position. But maybe you're saying, okay, well, doing it this way is more entertaining, so it's more likely for people to engage and learn, how to, what sort of points you could make in favor of this argument, this position. And of course, there is a fourth scenario where you're just doing it for your own entertainment, which, it's kind of selfish. Now you might say, well, if you're going to go so far as to say that you shouldn't make a negative appeal based on logic, shouldn't you logically make a positive appeal to emotion because you're wanting them to accept your position? Well, you got to be careful about that scenario where if people think they're being hit with an emotional appeal, that they're more resistant to accepting your position. So it's not necessarily going to be always a positive to make an emotional appeal. And also the backlash for if they swap sides and realize that they've had an emotional appeal against them, they're less apt to come back to your side if you present new arguments. Now, I suppose you could ask, well, what about Elijah on Mount Carmel? That seems to be the sort of negative emotional rhetoric that he's using as the prophets of Baal. Well, yeah, that might be right. But you do have to consider that he ends up killing them. And he was never really trying to convert them to his viewpoint, necessarily. But you, I suppose, could use that to argue for the case of when you're trying to convince the audience rather than the other party of using being able to use the negative emotional rhetoric against the other party.